Why, might you ask, is a Christian think tank wanting us to talk about death? It is no accident that we're meeting on All Saints' Day during All Hallowtide, the period in the Christian calendar when we remember the dead, including those who were martyred for their faith. All Hallowtide is a 3-day festival encompassing the fear and darkness of grief, and also the celebration of life beyond death. We exist in a society which keeps death at arm's length and out of sight. And as formal religious affiliation continues to decline, are we potentially losing a sense of the sacredness of both life and death? Christianity holds together the full range of emotions we experience in loss, from grief and celebration of life through to the hope of resurrection. But we are fully aware that the Church could do much better in helping people face their own mortality and prepare for their death. And we haven't done a good enough job of engaging people in this conversation, despite centuries of thinking about it. There is someone, though, who in recent years has worked tirelessly to improve the public's understanding of death and dying, and that is Dr Kathryn Mannix. Kathryn worked as a palliative care doctor in hospices, hospitals, and patients' own homes for 30 years. She is now the best-selling author of 2 books, With the End in Mind, stories about the way people live while they are dying, and Listen, stories that explore how we can all step up into those important yet daunting, tender conversations with our loved ones in our workplaces and communities. I am sure you'll be moved and challenged by what she says. So please welcome Dr. Kathryn Mannix to deliver the 2023 Theos Lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful music. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a wet, windy Wednesday night to think about dying. So, my fellow mortals, thank you for gathering this evening really to contemplate the universal truth that most of us spend our lives trying to avoid. Today is the traditional Christian feast of All Hallows or All Saints. Yesterday was All Hallows Eve, now the secular party day of Halloween. Tomorrow, some Christian traditions will mark the Feast of All Souls, remembering their dead. All around the world, many cultures are celebrating the Day of the Dead, celebrating the lives of their ancestors and remembering that each of us will, one day, be a deceased ancestor, a name on a memorial plaque, a grave, a photograph. Today begins a month associated with remembering those who died fighting their country's causes and those who died as a consequence of wars they neither sought nor prosecuted. This is the season of remembering others who have died, and Theos chose this date for their annual lecture because our theme is dying, an event that unites all of us in its waiting room. By now, it will be clear that we're going to discuss dying and death. Have I said those words often enough now? In a very direct way. I hope you'll find that the discussion is illuminating and that the company is supportive. But if you do find that difficult thoughts or memories are arising and you need to take some time outside the room, I want you to feel welcome to do that. And I promise we won't start to talk about you until you've actually left the room. So let's just find out about each other a bit. Let's explore the wisdom in the room. There are about 200 people in here tonight. And if I was really kind and suggested that our average age is 50, just because it makes the maths easier, then I think that makes 10,000 years experience between us. So what's our experience of being alongside dying? So I would like you to help me out by raising your hand really high. And if you're near the front and you want to see how many hands are up, turn around. It's a bit like looking at the bride as she comes down the aisle. Okay, we're allowed to do it tonight. So how many of us have been present at the moment a person stopped breathing as they died? Okay, so turn around and look. This is impressive. This is not your average night out, okay? And I have to tell you, you are not my average public audience either, okay? How many of us have been present during those final hours or days, even if we weren't there as the breathing stopped? Okay, and again, look at us all. Okay, again, we're not average. How many have been present during those final hours for 2 people or more? Okay, so that's not quite so many, but it's nearly as many, isn't it? 5 people or more? Okay, you're looking at your neighbours interestedly now, aren't you? 10 or more? 100 or more? Be proud, unless you're mass murderers. 1,000 or more? Right. Okay, so now we know who not to sit beside. This is always a really interesting and illuminating exercise because actually 100 years ago, we all would still have had our hands up at 10 and perhaps more. It shows us how insulated we've become to the act of dying. These people with many experiences here tonight, they are likely to be health or social care professionals, yeah? Or mass murderers, but probably not. Whilst 100 years ago, all of us in this audience would have had many attendances at deathbeds. When people died at home, they were looked after by their family and friends. Death wasn't a stranger, and its sequence of events and its process was familiar. Process, sequence of events. The thing is that dying is a bodily process, just like giving birth. It proceeds in recognisable series of steps. So when we did our calculation of deaths attended, I didn't tell you my score. In fact, by spending a career as a palliative care doctor, working in palliative care teams in hospitals and communities and in hospices, I've been the go-to medical advisor for teams of nurses and other allied health professionals for somewhere between 10 and 15,000 dying people. I'm not bragging, although if it was a competition, I probably would have won, just saying. I'm simply providing the source of my data, that I've been observing dying for 4 decades. And my current work in demystifying dying to improve public understanding is based on all that experience. And by going public with those observations, what I've discovered is a huge public hunger for better information about what I've come to call ordinary dying. My campaign tool is storytelling. And I'm going to begin with a story now. So, how did a perfectly contented and busy doctor exchange paid work in the NHS for life as a campaigner? So it was a journey of many steps, but there was a distinct tipping point. Over my 3 decades working specifically in palliative care, I found that our patients and the family and friendship groups around them rarely had any understanding of dying. And they had fears that were wretched visions of escalating pain or sudden collapse or slow suffocation. These are Hollywood deaths, and I'm going to refer to that phenomenon again later. The experience that tipped me over the edge was meeting a family gathered around an unconscious man in my hospital's emergency room. He'd come into hospital by ambulance, he'd collapsed at home, paramedic team had given him cardiopulmonary resuscitation, pressing on his chest hard enough to circulate the blood that was from his lungs with oxygen in through his heart and around his body. And they'd used a defibrillator in an attempt to restart his heart. And that's pretty traumatic. And it had restored electrical heartbeats on his monitor, but his weary heart just couldn't do it. It couldn't squeeze blood around his body anymore. And he was clearly in the late stages of dying. He'd had many long-standing medical problems. He'd been in and out of hospital with wearying and unrewarding regularity over the last few months for treatment of a stroke, leg pains caused by arterial disease, failing kidneys, heart problems. Yet it seems that at no point was there any discussion with him or with his family about the diminishing returns of medical treatment, as his 97-year-old body was just quite simply wearing out. His wife and sons had followed the ambulance, so they were beside him in the resuscitation room, and his wife was holding his hands and whispering in his ear, "I talked to his sons. I can see from the medical case notes, which were like this size, that your dad's been increasingly unwell over the last few months. In fact, I think I used the term a creaking gait." And they agreed that that was the case. So I said, well, what did he say he would want us to do if he was ever so sick that he might die? And they just looked at me blankly. They shook their heads and they said, oh, we didn't talk about stuff like that. And then there was a really long pause, and they looked at me, they looked at the mum and dad, they looked back at each other, and then one of them said, do you know, that's not entirely true. Dad did try to talk to me about it, and, well, I told him not to be so maudlin. And then he started clenching his jaw, you know, when you're trying really hard not to cry. So one of his brothers moved over to console him. So we're talking about the northern male here. He came and stood beside him, and he reached his arm out and he patted him on the shoulder while studiously avoiding eye contact, right? He said, it wasn't just you. Dad asked me if I'd fill in one of those power of attorney forms so that Mum didn't have to make her own. And I said, Dad, I tell you what, we'll do that to celebrate your 100th birthday. So these sons, who were unable to bear the idea of their dad's death, had no concept of dying or preparing themselves, were in their 60s and 70s. This is a situation I've come across countless times, but this time something struck me anew. We can't keep having these conversations, one person at a time, one family at a time. This isn't a palliative care problem. This isn't even a medical problem. This is a societal problem. And someone has to do something about the public understanding of dying. So, let's look at the public understanding of dying. There have been regular, well-conducted polls over the last few years that examine the actions and the experiences of samples of the UK population, and they show us that although around a third of the population has made a will, more likely if you're more wealthy, and 1 in 5 of us has made some indication of what kind of funeral we'd like, very few of us have made any plans at all for how we would like to live while we're dying. The most recent of the polls is a YouGov poll constructed by our hosts Theos earlier this year, and it shows that familiar with bereavement, being bereaved, is much more common than being familiar with the process of dying. People are not present at deathbeds. And as we get older, we're increasingly aware of it, so the oldest of us being most likely to have been present at a death, usually that of a spouse. But the data are dismal. The Theos data show that people remain unprepared for dying and also afraid of how it might come about. Mostly, that's a fear of enduring pain or of suffering. More than 57% of people are frightened about that. The Hollywood deaths, again. There's also fear of what happens afterwards. And interestingly, that's not so much fear of judgment and hell as missing out, FOMO, on future family events. More women worry about that than men. Or of no longer existing. More men than women. So who we are at our essence is a philosophical question that we haven't got time for this evening. Other than say that it is that we are embodied beings and we fear to contemplate what might happen as our bodies die. We postpone talking about it, planning for it, even thinking about it. So how has that happened? So now, by the magic of technology, the tech desk is going to make a graph appear for me. Yes, hooray, love it when it works. So, familiarity with dying would have been far higher 100 years ago. So life expectancy at birth was only in the 30s to mid-40s or younger till the 20th century. So this graph shows life expectancies at birth for England and Wales. So these are the Office for National Statistics data between 1881 and 2011. And it tells an important story, and I'm going to use Annie and her story to help us follow that. So Annie was born in 1900. Life expectancy for girls born in 1900 was 46 years of age. So what that means is that by the age of 46, half of the girls who were born in 1900 would be expected to have died. And the other half would be having their dying on the other side of that. Like women for centuries, Annie would have helped to look after sick and dying family and friends and neighbours, looking after them at home because hospital was expensive and hospital had nothing to offer people who were dying. So through her teens and 20s, which is in the 19-teens and the 1920s, Annie, supported by the wisdom and the experience of her mother and her aunts, she and her sisters and her girl cousins came to see dying often enough that she was familiar with the patterns of dying. She knew when to offer smaller meals, how appetite drops away as dying progresses. She knew that dying people are progressively more sleepy and then unconscious. She recognised that the rate of change was an indication of when to call family who were far away, when to send for the priest or the rabbi, when to stay present and keep vigil. She fully expected that she would pass that information on to her daughters in the fullness of time. But look at what is happening to life expectancy here. Oh, I think I've got a pointer. Oh, look at this. We have the technology. Over the first half of the 20th century, you can already see girls is the purple line and boys is the green line rising. And that's because we stopped babies from dying. Infant mortality was incredibly high. If a baby survives the first year of life, he or she is much more likely then to reach adulthood. So better sanitation, early immunisations, these were the sorts of things that reduced infant mortality markedly. And so that first part of the rise is here. This is 1948. What happened in 1948? Okay, inception of the NHS. Good, you are awake, it's good. And now look, it's still rising, and it's rising now because we can do things we couldn't do before. We've got antibiotics, we've got better anaesthetics, surgery can last longer. We've got machines that will replicate what lungs do, what kidneys do. We can transplant organs. So we can now offer hope of cure from previous fatal illness. So instead of staying at home and waiting to die with your sisters and your mother and your aunts looking after you, you go to hospital for treatment to postpone death. Postpone death. The life expectancy curve has continued to rise until very recently. Babies born in 2020, which aren't shown on here, have an average life expectancy of 87 for boys and 90 for girls. So Annie is living through this century of change. By the mid-1930s, in her 30s, She's a widow. Her husband has died of sepsis from a perforated appendix. Their oldest child died, aged 6, from diphtheria, an illness we routinely immunise children against. She reared her 4 surviving children through the war and into the peace. So she was 48 at the inception of the NHS. She's already survived beyond the average for her cohort. So Annie's story is relevant and important to me for 2 reasons. First, she and her family show us the change in causes and in understanding of mortality across the 20th century. And secondly, she's my mum's mum. She's my maternal grandmother, and she fully expected to teach her daughters the care of their dying relatives. But changes in 20th century medicine meant that that opportunity never arose. So instead, at the age of 97, which was in the year... Oh yeah, you are awake. She taught me, her granddaughter, this insight. She was worried about her children and what would happen to them as she was dying because, she said, I don't think they've ever seen anybody die. That was a brilliant insight on her part. In the lifetime of a single generation, born just before World War II and growing into adulthood with the benefits of 20th century progress in healthcare, the people of the United Kingdom forgot what dying looked like. This pattern is reproduced across high-income countries all around the world, and we've gained such a lot, but it's come at this price, that we have lost the everyday wisdom of ordinary dying. Instead of it being an intimate, domestic, personal process, dying has been medicalised. Escalating treatments of increasing complexity and also often of increasing hopelessness protract the dying process, and death itself has become a medical failure. The trouble is, thanks, we can turn the graph off now, thank you. Trouble is, we don't know what we don't know. Our understanding of dying no longer rooted in personal, tender experience, so instead we take what information is available from TV dramas and cinema and death as entertainment, zombie movies, shoot-'em-up games, because that's very much alive. So these distorted, sensationalised, and yet at the same time trivialised accounts of human dying, the Hollywood deaths, are now the basis of our fears about dying, exacerbated, of course, by media reports of dreadful dying. Stories that are a mixture of misunderstanding and sensationalism, and, important to acknowledge, occasionally, those difficult deaths that are unusual but tragic for everybody involved. So to think about relative numbers, I want to think for a moment about air travel. If all you knew about air travel came from news media, would you ever get on a plane? News media report tragedies that are true. Yet we all understand that those terrible true events are a tiny slice of a massive pie. Every day, 200,000 flights move 6 million people around our planet. They are usually conveyed safely from one airport to another. Sometimes they arrive on time. Occasionally their luggage comes as well. We understand about air travel that the tragic is exceptional. So part of the mission to reacquaint the public with ordinary dying is to acknowledge that there are sometimes difficult and uncomfortable deaths, tragic for the dying person and for those who love them, yet also that these are rare and they comprise a tiny slice of the total pie. The better we understand the process of ordinary dying, the less likely we will be to misunderstand it, to awfulise it, and be traumatised by witnessing it. So all of this is setting the scene for describing the process of ordinary dying. You might want to hold the hand of the person next to you. It's a fascinating observation that doesn't matter what the illness is, that brings about the very end of our lives, the final pathway towards death, is remarkably similar from one person to another. Much the same way that giving birth is a process with specific and recognizable stages, so with dying. And the first change is a change in energy levels. Towards the end of their lives, people become weary. Their energy is recharged not so much by eating or drinking as by sleep. Initially, short naps restore energy. As time goes by, sleep lasts longer, periods of awake become shorter. I have to tell you, this is not the afternoon nap for anybody who's getting a bit anxious at this point, because that's a choice that many of us make. This need for sleep at this stage of life is irresistible. It's like a phone battery just running out of charge, and sleep is the charger. The next change is depth of sleep. This is a change not noticed by the dying person, but we who are caring for them notice this. There are periods when they become unrousable, no longer simply asleep, but actually unconscious. So we might try to waken them for a visitor or a special phone call or it's medicine time, and we find we can't rouse them. And when they wake up later, they report a peaceful sleep. They have no perception of having been unconscious. It's a state we seem to be unaware of. This stage is often the trigger to changing the route of medications, for example, painkillers, drugs for breathlessness or nausea, because we don't want those symptoms to come back if doses are missed because the person can't be woken temporarily. Sometimes people get stuck in a state between awake and asleep, apparently awake, and yet responding to things we can't see or hear. This muddledness responds best to calm and to familiar faces and voices, although sometimes people become so restlessly agitated that they need expert use of sedating drugs to ease them back to a peaceful state. Eventually, a dying person is unconscious for all or almost all of the time. This isn't caused by medication. This is simply the way that dying happens. The unconscious brain produces reflex automatic breathing cycles that move between deep breathing and more shallow breathing, and between fast breathing and gradually slower breathing. Most of us have never witnessed this type of breathing, and without explanations, the unusual noises and rhythms can cause onlookers to misinterpret it as breathlessness, for example, or struggle or distress. We need good, experienced interpreters to help us, and that was the role my Nana's mother and aunts had played for her. As dying progresses, the heart beats less strongly and the pulse becomes fainter. Skin may feel cool and clammy, and the dying person may look pale. Their nails and lips may take on a bluish tinge as less oxygen is circulated. All of this is normal. As unconsciousness deepens, that most sensitive area at the very back of the throat, that bit that causes us to swallow or cough or gag if even a tiny crumb of toast or a drop of water touches it, becomes insensitive. It's now possible that a small volume of saliva or mucus, perhaps a teaspoonful, can lie at the back of the throat without triggering a cough. So now the air, which is still moving freely in and out of the lungs, causes this fluid to bubble and rattle, the sound that's known as the death rattle. And it's a disconcerting noise to listen to, and yet it's a signal of deep unconsciousness. The person no longer feels a tickle from that fluid at the back of their throat. They are dying safely, something that my Nana, something that our foremothers understood. And finally, during a phase of shallow, slow breathing, there's a breath out that simply isn't followed by another. There's nothing special about that final breath. There's no sudden rush of awareness or pain or panic. It's so not Hollywood. It's very, very gentle. The dying is over. Or almost. In fact, The heart may carry on beating weakly for a few more minutes until its oxygen supply runs out. My grandmother understood dying. From watching it, she learnt to recognise the stages and the phases, to discern what was the background process and what was individual to this particular person. She was guided by the wisdom of the women who were with her, and that's why I've chosen stories as my campaign tool. By telling real stories of ordinary dying, I hope readers and listeners will begin to see the patterns and recognise the process, just as Annie learned them. What's become clear since I began this public storytelling is how vast the hunger is for good information. People have written to me from all over the world to tell me how these stories explained their own experiences at deathbeds, or helped them prepare their families for an imminent death, or how, by recognising the process, readers were able to accompany their dying person with more confidence and less fear. I get messages like this several times every month. This afternoon I was speaking at the Royal College of Physicians. The chairperson of the session, who introduced me, told the audience, and hadn't told me beforehand, that at his mother's deathbed a few months before, one of his daughters was anxious about Granny's breathing, and the other daughter explained it shows that she's deeply unconscious. He said to her, "How do you know that?" And she said, "I read a book about it, Dad. You should read it." Sadly, I also receive messages that tell me about unanticipated dying, that nobody told me that she could die. Lack of clarity leads families to be unprepared for a death. They're often given medical information: low blood pressure, kidneys struggling to cope, lungs not working very well. But unless healthcare professionals make the possibility of dying explicit, families just don't expect it. Decisions are made that result in over-treatment and in medicalisation of dying here and in other high-income countries, whilst in many less wealthy places around the world, there are deaths from completely treatable causes without access even to basic pain relief. And that stark contrast in different versions of dying badly, triggered the recent and very powerful Lancet Commission on the value of death. The Commission highlights that our relationship with death is not just at the end of an individual's life, but rather about the way dying people and those who care for and grieve for them experience that process, how whole societies and the social fabric of communities play a role in supporting or ignoring the facts of death, how dying is both personal and relational, how death is more than a bodily process, and how it is the fact of death that makes living precious. That is the value of death. The Commission calls for stories about everyday dying. Hurrah! About death and grief to become common, to restore death to its rightful place in our lives. And yet, we're giving away the very language of mortality. Those D words have become socially taboo, replaced with euphemisms like passing and late, that make it ever harder to discuss dying in a pragmatic, realistic way. I believe we can fudge our communication by resorting to euphemisms, and I know from direct experience that those D words can be used with deep compassion, and that individuals and their families are grateful to be prepared with kindness and concern despite the heartbreaking reality those words convey. A lifetime among dying people has taught me some helpful things. First, towards the end of our lives, most of us look back to work out what it's all been about. There's a kind of lifetime audit, viewed through the lens of what matters most to that person, their personal values. That may be a faith or a set of principles derived from ideas like environmentalism to pacifism to stoicism, or political views like trades unionism or liberal democracy. They seem like the safe ones to say. Whatever their system, this is a spiritual construct, a lens through which individuals view life and its meaning. And this is why Theos's current examination of death and society is so appropriate. Another respected voice in promoting tender conversations. Next, I've learned that although no one usually feels keen about dying, those on their deathbeds are often more concerned about their beloveds than about themselves. They have things to say, and their dearest people can help by listening. The last messages are consistent, and they echo softly around the world in hospitals, ambulances, in peaceful bedrooms and at disaster scenes. Remember those phone messages we heard on the news from the Twin Towers? The last messages seem to be universal, and they need to be heard. Thank you. Dying people are grateful to their people. They are grateful to have lived. They appreciate our contributions to their life story. I'm sorry. There's regret for past mistakes, for hurts caused and opportunities missed. It means so much to be reconciled and forgiven, if that is possible. I forgive you. Reconciliation works both ways. Here, at the edge of life, those old disagreements often seem petty. It may even be hard to work out how they escalated so much. Letting go of them, offering forgiveness, is as much for the giver as for the recipient of that absolution. Most of all, though, what we hear and witness is the repeated message of I love you. We don't mention love easily in our society, yet in the end, at the very end, it is love that matters the most. Death and love walk hand in hand through our final days. Or perhaps this is the time when we finally discover that death has been our lifelong companion. Where does this leave us? Well, I think it leaves us in no doubt that it's important to reclaim the public understanding of dying. Loss of understanding has led to fear, supposition and dread, avoidance of discussion and preparation, medical overtreatment, poor public policy about carer and bereavement leave or support, and bereavements complicated by regret at not having said or done the things that matter most. It leaves us in need of better death education in schools of nursing, medicine, and other health professions, while we continue to take students from a population that's unfamiliar with dying and then train them to believe that their sole task is to prevent death. Then we will continue to misunderstand dying, misperceive its approach, and fail to narrate it well as it evolves, so that companions can understand what they're observing. It leaves us in need of sensible, age-appropriate death education in schools. Childhood is the time to sow those seeds of understanding when curious minds are not complicated by the emotional overlay of the adult world. Life cycle education should be a component of the national curriculum, and all children should leave school with a working level of death literacy. It's refreshing to see grassroots responses to the loss of death wisdom. The growth of the end-of-life doula movement is a welcome development. Lay people trained to be end-of-life companions, able to help dying people and their dear ones to broach those tender conversations about their wishes for care and companionship as life draws to an end, and able to keep vigil with families, explaining the phases of dying and helping everyone to be calmly present with better understanding and less fear. There is a clear and present need for public health approach to public understanding of dying, awareness raising using, for example, commissioned plots in soap operas. So Brazil doubled organ donation rates by that method. Discussion articles in magazines and newspapers, documentaries and discussions on TV and radio, use of social media campaigns, use of news events like the deaths of celebrities to promote public discussion. The death of the Queen was a trigger to a big conversation about whether or not she died suddenly. No. We've been watching her body failing for 2 years. Encouragement of organisations like places of worship, libraries, sports clubs, shared interest associations to make time for conversations that support their members' understanding of dying. So, as I bid you all good evening, I wish us all a meaningful life, grounded in contentment, punctuated by moments of joy, and a well-prepared and comfortable death when our time comes. We all know the date of the first incomplete day of our lives, the day we joined the world. But it's the very fact of that other incomplete day that still awaits us that makes living now so precious. Let's relish every day that remains to us and ask ourselves what we can do to be ambassadors for better public understanding of dying. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening.
Kathryn, thank you so much for your words. There was so much there. I found it incredibly moving and challenging and also inspiring. There's probably a lot of feelings in the audience at the moment, and there may be questions bubbling up for you that you'll have the opportunity to ask Kathryn shortly. The animation that we just showed was called Dying for Beginners, and we released it last week. And Emily and our team created it, working with Kathryn and others in the team, including Andrew Greystone. And we've had such an amazing response to it. We've been overwhelmed by the number of people who have watched it. So we'd encourage you to share that on social media and in your networks as well. First of all, I've got a couple of questions, Kathryn. You talked a little bit about last messages, and I wanted to dig in a bit to those. From what you've observed watching 10,000 to 15,000 people die, what have you learnt about the place of belief in their final moments? Beliefs about God or religion or not? Or
it's a really interesting thing, and I get asked this a lot. And the thing that I've observed, and I talk to other people in palliative care, and there are some here this evening, one of the things that we find is that it's uncertainty that is the uncomfortable place for people. So people who have a life value that's had their whole heart and their commitment and they've lived to it and they're quite sure about it, whether that's theist or atheist, interestingly, are equally certain that what they believe, what they know is going to happen. So they are more confident and they're experiencing less uncertainty. The majority of the population is a lukewarm, went to a school where we sang some hymns in assembly, not quite sure about God, maybe I should have been a bit more sure about God a bit earlier. Oh, that old stuff, that's for grannies. Or is it? Because now I'm a little bit anxious because I didn't used to believe it. So it's that kind of uncertain place that's most uncomfortable for us. So my recommendation is for young people to pick a position and stick to it.
I know which one I would pick, or encourage you to pick. You paint a picture of the ease of predictable death due to illness, so you call it ordinary dying. What have you learnt about death in general? Would you say anything about the psychological preparedness for death in general, whether that's ordinary dying or dying in other circumstances? What have you learnt?
Yeah, so it is interesting that there is a subgroup of people in the population, and spoiler, we spotted them in the Theos report as well, of people who have begun their preparations, often quite young, who think about it, who prepare for it. And often what they're doing isn't so much talking about, if I have this illness, please do this, and if I have that illness, please do that, because you just can't cover all the bases, can you? More helpfully, and something that we can all go home and do, is that they talk about what matters most to them. So that if I'm later that person's doctor and they're not able to represent their views for themselves anymore, and I can say to the family, what matters most to your mum, they're able to say, well, actually, mum, she's a mountaineer. She likes to be out and about. It's really important for her that she's able-bodied. She can stride up mountains. Okay, she's got this really life-challenging situation here now. There's a small chance that I could eke out a few more months of living for her by doing this treatment, but she wouldn't get out of an intensive care unit, for example. That doesn't sound like it wraps around what matters most to this person. Whereas for somebody else who's saying, well, actually, what matters most to her is there's a granddaughter going to be born in 4 months' time. She wants to know that the baby is safely born. Okay, that's a completely different set of values. So it helps us then to be able to individualise. So 2 elderly women with the same presentation of a big heart attack, a big stroke, something like that, I have completely different things that matter most to them. And they shouldn't have the same treatment. They should have treatment that wraps itself around helping to achieve what it is that will be satisfying to them.
Okay, over to you. We have a couple of roving mics. I think Sarah's got one and Naomi. Hands up if you have a question. Is it working? Yes. Right, let's go to the front.
Thank you, Anne Kenrick. I run something called End of Life Matters. Very, very quick story and a question. So I also have a granny who was born in 1900. She was called Eleanor, and she was a nurse, and she lived until she was 90. And on her 90th birthday, she went into hospital with pneumonia. And when the children came the next day, including my mother, they were told that the doctors had managed to bring her back from death. And the 6 children were in a trauma because they knew her mother would have wanted to die. But the doctors wouldn't listen to them because they said the children would benefit from the death of their mother. And interestingly, it was only her vicar who influenced the doctors to agree that she could die after 90 years of fantastic life. And I just wondered whether the role of the church was still recognised in hospitals, in care, as a sort of authority that would be listened to.
Okay, so there's several layers to unpack in that. So the first thing is that by law in England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, nobody can speak for us unless we have legally appointed them to have powers of attorney for health and welfare. And there's even an extra clause about life-saving or life-limiting decisions. So your partner of 60 years cannot speak for you unless you've given them those powers. So if you haven't given anybody those powers yet, obviously I'm only speaking to the mortals in here, it's time you did. And it's no good giving people the powers without telling them what matters most to you, because otherwise they will have to guess, and then they will worry. And so what you're doing is giving them a massive burden to carry for the rest of their lives, because they will worry about what if, should I have done this, should I have done that. So please appoint people with powers of attorney. Appoint people whom you trust. Appoint people to whom you can speak and describe what matters most to you. Sometime during my medical lifetime, probably about 20 years ago, chaplains were removed from the list of clinicians in hospitals and thereby debarred from reading case notes or writing in case notes. I don't understand why that happened. I think it was a very, very backward step. However, chaplaincy is alive and well and living in hospitals near us, constantly developing. Most hospitals now have, as well as the local denominations who worship in the area, they will have a multi-faith person, they will often have a humanist chaplain, and all of the chaplains are brilliant at holding space in a crisis where there's existential distress. You don't need to be a Methodist to be brilliantly helped by the Methodist chaplain. And I certainly spoken to a woman who was at the bedside of her dying child and had her other two children in the waiting room of the Children's Intensive Care Unit at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And it was the Muslim chaplain who came and looked after the children and looked after the mum when she came in and out, even though this was a Jewish family. So we need to be able to hold each other in kindness and respect and to see the skill of the chaplaincy team, regardless of what the faith is of the people who might be in need of support. So is the church respected as it was then? Probably not. But is it an important part of emotional, spiritual, existential support for people of all faiths and none? Yes, it absolutely is.
Okay, let's take another question from this person in the back with their hand up in the middle-ish back.
Hello, we've got a couple of paediatric nurses here. A number of your stories have been about people dying at the end of lives, at sort of an old age. I'm really interested to hear how we can support parents to prepare themselves and their children and siblings, this is quite a big question, for death, when actually these deaths don't feel ordinary and it feels really appropriate for us to be uncomfortable, alarmed when a child dies because it's not okay. So, yeah, I don't know whether I've asked that articulately or not, but I'm interested to know what your thoughts are about children dying well. Is it possible for a child to die well, is I suppose the ultimate question.
So I'm a little bit cautious about the phrase dying well in the first place, because I think it becomes a new tyranny that we've got to live up to. I think there's something about dying comfortably enough and in a way that is sufficiently resigned to the circumstances that we're not thrashing and fighting in a way that is grievous for us and grievous for the people who love us. But having said that, the death of a child is the wrong social order, and we all grieve it. And we often deal with the fact of a child approaching dying by trying not to think about it. And the difficulty is, and this is my clinical experience from working in our regional children's cancer service for about 16 years, that children guess, children know, children then know there's a big secret. It's something to do with them. It's something terrible. Every time they try and ask, the grown-ups get all upset and leave the room or change the subject. And I see you nodding. I know you know this is true. So how do we help parents to be present to the reality of the fact that their children are dying and the fact that their children need to understand and be able to talk about it? First time I ever came across this, I was a third-year medical student picking my way across a play carpet in a children's ward, trying not to stand on the Lego. You can picture the room, can't you? And there's a child sitting there, and I trod on his car. So I sat down to help him reassemble it. And he said, I like the red ones best, but I really want some blue ones. But somebody else has got the blue ones and he won't give them to me, and it's not fair because I'm going to die soon. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And then he said, who will look after my mummy? And I probably, because I was sitting down, I couldn't get away fast enough. I was probably the first person who hadn't run away when he'd said a D word. So I didn't know what to say. I said, well, I think probably we will look after your mummy, won't we? I'm thinking, oh, beam me up, Scotty. So I managed to kind of commandeer some blue bricks to curry a bit of favour, and I ran to the nurse's office and burst into tears. And they said, you've been talking to Jimmy, haven't you? So we did it to everybody, it turns out. But it taught me that children can talk about dying without all of that stuff that we carry as an overlay, and that actually they want practical, useful, sensible information. If you're not going to be alive, where are you going to be? Who will look after you while you're dying? Can you have visitors in heaven? I got asked once.
Can you?
So, do you know what? I haven't been able to get through on the helpline, so I'm not sure. So it's really tricky, but it's really important that we answer their questions as honestly as we can. And that's very hard when there's a sibling group, and the siblings have different understandings at different ages, and some of them are old enough to know, and some of them perhaps aren't old enough to know, and what order do you tell them in so they don't whisper amongst each other? And it's really complicated when it's children. But it's important, and we have to think about it, and there's really wise expert guidance like you guys, thank goodness for you all. There's a brilliant book called Follow the Child, which is written by the mum of a boy navigating his last illness with a brain tumour. And what she says is, when they ask, follow their lead. And that seems to me to be very wise.
Let's take 3 questions, because I know that we have lots of questions. Here? Yes?
Thank you. My name's James Normand. I'm here as a trustee of a Christian charity called At a Loss. So this question is more about bereavement than dying. And it's about the church's role, if you like, in bereavement, dealing with bereavement. So we provide a sort of signposting service for the bereaved, and we also the home of the bereavement journey, which is a program for people to deal with their own bereavement. My question is, do you think that the church has allowed itself to be influenced by the prevailing culture of death avoidance, which is what you've been talking about, and in so doing is missing out an opportunity to be a leader in society, in social transformation and spiritual nurture? And I ask that because we seem to have become, At a Loss has become the sort of go-to source of comment for the media, often on the spiritual aspect of bereavement. And this is particularly so during the pandemic and, as you've already mentioned, after the death of the Queen. That's really my question is where's the church been in all of this?
Thank you. As first question, we will go somewhere. One person here with their hand up, and then we'll come down to this person here.
Hi, my name's Alana Harris. I am a hospital chaplain some of my time. And so just to mention, at my trust, we actually do read and write on patients' notes. I don't know, I'm quite new to it. I don't know if that's unusual, but just to say it does happen in some places. But my question is actually about children. So earlier this year, I had the remarkable task of preparing my young children for the death of their uncle. And it was amazing to me how receptive they were to that conversation, how good it was to be able to have conversations about death with young children. But then really sort of a real gear shift working with the school and the nursery on those conversations, because their carers were not comfortable having those conversations and preparing and working with us as parents. And so I'm really interested in what you have to say about schools and that part of your campaign work. Really excited to hear more about that, basically. Would love to hear more. Thanks.
Thank you. And here in the middle.
Thank you. Matthew Hutton. I love your phrase, ordinary dying, and your story about aeroplanes, as one who's taking a flight in 2 days' time. When I was a practicing solicitor, I was always amused by the fact that it was going on holiday that prompted people to come in and make wills, as if they were more likely. But my question really is this, that if you contrast ordinary dying with sudden deaths, and you made a comment about the frequency, if you like, of ordinary dying, are there any statistics, say within the UK, to say that X% of deaths are, quote, ordinary dying, and X% are sudden deaths?
Great. Okay, so there's a question, where is the church? There was a question about schools and campaigning, and there's a question about stats about...
Okay, so I'm not sure that I'm the person who can address a question about the role of the church. I think maybe the director of Theos, if she was around, could do that.
I was going to let you start. Yes, so as we know, there has been a decline in the kind of religious affiliation, fewer people attending church. But I think the church should absolutely be stepping into a space, because those are the times when people are dying, where people are asking those existential questions, those questions about what it means to be human, about what happens when we die. And actually the church is in every community around the country and is able to step into that space. Now, you'll see in our upcoming report that's due out later this month about what we think that the church could be doing on that. We released a report earlier this year called Ashes to Ashes, which talked about the changing trends in death, dying, burials, etc. And what we saw was there's been a massive increase in the number of direct cremations. So people just wanting someone to deal with the body, and not necessarily, they might get the ashes back, but there's no kind of ceremony or ritual. And actually we think that that's not good, because I think that people aren't dealing with both the loss and the grief and the bereavement that comes afterwards. So it's absolutely a space that the church can step into. But there has been a decline in the amount of resource that some denominations are putting into death and burial. There's probably a self-consciousness that comes from this kind of decline in religious affiliation, where churches aren't necessarily putting themselves forward. So we are going to be calling for the church to do a bit more on that, and absolutely stepping into that space. Schools.
We know that roughly any class of 30 children will have one child who's personally closely bereaved of a parent, a sibling, or a significantly close grandparent or other person. And yet, we do not include dealing with terminally ill children or bereaved children in the curricula of teacher training. And there's some people here tonight from St Mary's University in Twickenham who are looking at doing that. And I really absolutely applaud that that's something that they're looking into, because pastoral care for children happens in schools. And it's really important that schools are equipped, that the leadership understands how to respond when there's been a significant death, a member of staff, or the lollipop lady, or a child in the school. We have to be able to understand how we're going to talk about that in an age-appropriate way. I remember how deeply moving it was to hear my children come home from school after 9/11, about a week later, and each of them talk about the assemblies that have been held in the high school for one and in the middle school for the other, to talk about how sad we were, to talk about terrorism, to talk about loss and bereavement. And hats off to the head teachers in those schools who stepped up to that. But actually, it is a vacuum. and all children's services who have to liaise into schools about deaths talk about how difficult it is to get teachers to feel sufficiently confident to manage the situation. It's not that they're not willing, it's that they lack confidence, and it needs probably to be a core to teacher training curriculum. And then teams like yours can go out into schools to support when there's a particular child who's terminally ill, for example, and wants contact with their classmates. Or, look, my daughter's a school nurse, they're doing a whole school intervention in a school a couple of years ago where a child in the high school had taken their own life, and there were siblings throughout the whole of the school pyramid system affected by that, and friends who were affected by that. So schools need to be aware and be capable of responding well.
Thank you. And then stats about ordinary dying versus sudden death.
Yes, there are, and they're changing. And if you're really bored one afternoon, you can go on the Office for National Statistics website and put some searches in. But to save you the bother, when I first qualified as a doctor, about half of deaths were predicted deaths and half of deaths were sudden deaths, because strokes and heart attacks were often rapidly fatal. And now we've got so many people taking preventative medicines to prevent strokes and heart attacks. And when they do happen, we've got interventions that suck the gubbins out of the blocked up arteries very quickly so that the brain or the heart recover. So now only about 12% of deaths are those sudden, unanticipated events, and often those are against the background of actually knowing somebody's circulation isn't so great, their heart isn't so good. So they are conversations that could have been having. And then about another 8 to 10% of deaths will be sudden and unexpected because they're accidents or they're crimes. But most of us will die of an illness or illnesses that will gradually force attrition upon us, and we will go through a recognisable process. If we live long enough, the chances are rising that one of the illnesses that will claim us is dementia. Dementia is not just a loss of memory. Dementia is an organ failure illness. So we expect a heart failure or a lung failure or a liver failure illness to affect our whole body after a while. And we forget that dementia is brain failure. It controls swallowing, it controls digestion, it controls how we manage our blood pressure. So eventually, as the brain fails, the body is no longer able to survive without its brain in the driving seat. And so we have to be realistic about that as well.